seminar, but it's great that we were able to have a Zoom seminar at all, and that Zoom was invented for this purpose, to be able to have an international guest come and give a talk about their science. And today we've got Constantin Zohner from ETH Zurich. He's a lead scientist in the Crowther Lab, which focuses on global plant responses to climate change, and specifically his work is focusing on phenology and the effect of climate change on phenology, which is that he's published quite a few recent and very interesting, sort of engaging papers on the effects of climate change on global temperate forest phenology, which is a really interesting and important topic, especially considering we're now at the end of a very late autumn in Indiana. So certainly we are seeing the effects of these changes in climate now. So it's great to have you here, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Thanks.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. All right. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be able to talk about my favorite topic, which is phenology. And in this talk, I mainly want to talk about the drivers, or untangling, how we can untangle the drivers of autumn leaf senescence in northern forests. In the beginning, I will talk first a bit about spring phenology, so that I will also sneak that in a bit, but the major part of the talk will be about autumn phenology. And yeah, why study autumn phenology, or why study phenology in general? First of all, it has cascading effects on ecosystems. It affects species interactions, the changes we see at the moment. They affect also nutrient cycling. They have effects on the water balance of ecosystems, and they affect the overall global carbon cycle. And the consequences of phenology for the carbon cycle are very nicely illustrated by this NASA simulation. So what we see here is the CO2 concentrations over the course of a year, and we see these red colors, especially at high latitudes, which indicate high CO2 concentrations. And as we move into spring and summer, we see that these colors, they start to fade. So CO2 concentrations are decreasing, and this is caused by one single event, essentially, the emergence of leaves in temperate and boreal regions. So we see the drastic effects that, global ecosystems and in that case plants have on ecosystems, and how they really regulate these seasonal and also long-term biogeochemical cycles. And then, wait, how do I continue this here? So obviously we have these, unfortunately, due to humans, we have drastic amounts of carbon emissions every year. So on average, CO2 concentrations, they are going up every year, and we need to do everything to stop that. But what we also see, what is shown by this red line, is that we have these drastic variations within a year. And as I said before, this is caused by vegetation, because vegetation is active in the summer and not active in the winter. And of course, we can imagine that if growing seasons are now changing, this might affect these seasonal cycles. So the overall question, of course, is how does climate change in the end, how does this all affect ecosystems, and how does this affect carbon uptake or carbon release of ecosystems? And what we see here is basically a simulation of different Earth system models simulating the cumulated land flux, meaning our ecosystems in the future, can we expect them to take up more carbon in the future, or can we expect them to actually release carbon? And what we see here is a drastic divergence between models. So some models, they predict that, yes, ecosystems, because they will grow more, we have CO2 fertilization, plants will grow more, which means more carbon uptake. So ecosystems, they might take up actually more carbon, meaning this might help us in the fight against climate change, whereas other models, they predict more or less the opposite, namely that ecosystems, they will, instead of being carbon sinks, they will act as sources in the future and start releasing carbon. And this would mainly be driven by increases in soil respiration and losses in soil carbon. So we see that the future is quite uncertain. And this, of course, means we need to do a lot better in predicting vegetation cycles, in predicting ecosystems, and forecasting what is going to happen, to ultimately forecast what's going to happen in the future and how this all feeds back to the climate system. So one important question here is, how does climate change affect the vegetation periods? Will the vegetation periods of plants, meaning the periods when they actually are able to take up carbon from the atmosphere, will these periods become longer or shorter under climate change? What's going to happen? And as I already said in the beginning, I want to start with spring leaf out, because it's just the obvious, the start of the season. So it's the first time of the year when plants become active and when they start to do photosynthesis. And what we see at the moment, so this is a recent paper where we basically try to get the most long-term series that are available. And there is this one really special time series, which is the cherry flowering in Japan. The reason we have this long-term series is that there is this festival happening, the spring festival happening every year in Japan. And it happens exactly on the day when these cherry trees start flowering, and people luckily have recorded when this festival happens. So we have a very precise record of when flowering of these cherry trees happened over the past, basically. This is shown for 500 years, but actually the records go even more back into the past, but they become a bit more uncertain, which is why we choose to show these 500 years. And so the main question was a bit similar to what we also see with climate change. What people always argue is, well, the climate has been changing in the past and it will do so in the future. So climate change is not really a thing because it's always changing. And similar to climate change, what we see here is, no, that's not really true. At least if we look at like these on a century to millennial timescale, we see that flowering has been rather stable. Of course, there is large interannual variation, but on average, flowering has been rather stable in these cherry trees. And now we see these rapid advances in flowering times. And the question, of course, is that going to continue in the future, or will there be other factors that might counteract these advances? And we see, that the upper panel shows that the same is true for European oak trees, where we see these drastic advances that are happening over the past decades. So the question, of course, is what is actually what is triggering spring leaf out? And historically, there have been like there's three main cues that have been suggested to be the main drivers. One is spring warming. So two of them are temperature related. One is spring warming. That's an obvious cue. We know that if the warmer the springs, the earlier they leave out. This is exactly what we saw in these graphs. But there are two other drivers that might play a role. One is winter chilling, meaning that most trees, but also herbaceous plants, they need a certain amount of cooling temperature during winter to be able to leave out in spring, and the less chilling they have, the later they can be expected to leave out in spring. So this would like kind of counterbalance the spring warming effect. And day length, like photoperiod control, might also play a role in some species. And the question, of course, is what is the relative importance of each of these drivers, and will these other drivers apart from spring warming start to become more important in the future and kind of counteract these advances in spring warming? The problem we have, or like something that is happening at the moment. It's not really a problem, but it's just something that makes it all more complex, is that there are many publications coming out at the moment that suggest many more drivers that might play an additional role. So there's publications that actually say that we need to consider also the role of daytime versus nighttime warming, making it a bit more complex. We need to consider the role of humidity in spring, which might play an additional role. We need to affect rainfall frequency. We need to account for rainfall frequency as well. We need to even account for leave out in the previous year, which might play a role in determining next year's leave out date. And most recently, there has even been a study that suggested that if you are very active in one year, in the next year, you will actually leave out earlier. So this study was like, the title kind of sounds that all the study is saying is that spring phenology is linked to carbon uptake. So earlier spring leave out should lead to more carbon uptake in that year. But actually, this is not what they really suggest. It's really that they're saying if in the previous year, you had a lot of carbon uptake in the next year, this will affect next year's spring phenology, which sounded really, kind of weird to me. And I was always thinking that if these drivers are all true, we are way out of our ability to predict anything anymore, because there's so many drivers now. So apart from these three historic drivers, we now have humidity, precipitation, and many more drivers that might play a role, making it really complex to predict what's going to happen in the future. And so this is becoming quite complex. And the main question was, are these drivers actually all really important, or are there still some major drivers that we can focus on, whereas other drivers might not be as important? And I want to pick out the example of growing season productivity, because it was such an interesting result to me that, as I said, basically what was suggested is that if you are very active in the previous year, you leave out earlier. This affects leave out, which is shown by these right box plots. This is basically the effect size of the activity in the previous year and how it affects leave out dates in the next year. So the question to me was, is that really true, or is there maybe a correlation with other drivers that has not been considered? Can we really trust these interpretations? And so the main data set we can use to test all these assumptions it's called the Pan-European Phenology Database, but anyone who knows about geography of Europe will immediately see that this is basically the German-speaking phenology database, or the phenology database for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, which it seems that historically, I think German-speaking people have just always been very, very interested in phenology, and there's a lot of long-term databases available. And so with these databases, or with these long-term observations for different sites on tree species, we can really test all these patterns. And so I looked at this simple correlation that was also shown in this publication. Basically, in that case, it's the temperature of the growing season the previous year as an indicator of also the productivity of that year. We could replace temperature with productivity, it would be the same. So does temperature of the previous year affect leave out? And yes, there's a strong negative correlation. But now what if we actually control for something where we know it has a really strong effect, which is spring temperature itself? And if we include spring temperature as an additional driver, we see that the effect of temperature in the previous year, that it already drastically decreases. And now there's one last thing that has to be considered, which is that temporal trends, they're never independent of each other. So I can basically correlate anything that has a temporal change with spring leave out, and I will see a correlation simply because there is a temporal autocorrelation in the data. So one relatively simple way to account for that is to simply additionally include year as an additional effect. So just look at, is there a temporal trend in leave out? And if we then additionally include year as an effect, we see that this effect of the growing season temperature or growing season productivity of the previous year, it completely disappears. So we're left with spring temperature being a very, very important driver, and year seems to have an effect, which means there is a temporal trend in leave out happening that we can't only explain by spring temperature, or at least the way spring temperature is calculated here, but at least this effect of growing season temperature of the previous year completely disappears. So there's basically one driver less that we have to consider now, which is nice. And what I'm trying to do right now is to really look at the relative importance of all these possible drivers. And it's a pretty preliminary analysis, but if we look at all these drivers, yeah, I'm not going to explain all these drivers like their spring leave out. That means it's the effect of the leave out of the previous year. These TQ2, 3 is like temperature of the previous growing season, the Q2, Q3, and Q4 of the year. We have air humidity, we have soil moisture, we have radiation in there, and we have, as I said, year. And Tmax, that's spring temperature. And if we look at all these box plots, we see that spring temperature by far has the most important effect on leave out. So while it might be true that there are other drivers that play a role, so far spring temperature still seems to be the main driver that we need to consider and that we need to focus on, and even chilling temperatures that have always been suggested to play a role and that might be reduced because it's getting warmer. Chilling might be chilling requirements might be not met anymore in the future. It seems that temperatures are still cold enough during winter to fulfill chilling requirements, meaning that it's still spring temperature that is driving spring phenology, or mainly driving spring phenology. And yeah, to come back to this initial figure of these long-term trends, this also very well explains why we still see these changes continuing over recent decades. It is spring temperature that is still driving these major trends that we see. Right, so now that was a bit about spring phenology. So now I want to shift to autumn phenology and basically ask, how do plants know when to stop and when to develop these senescent leaves, when to basically lose their leaves. And this whole process of leaf senescence, of course, is a very interesting process. There's a lot of things going on. And usually what we see is the end result when the leaves are already then developing these beautiful yellow or red colors. But the main question is still, how do plants actually know when to initiate all these processes? And one thing that of course comes to mind is temperature. So obviously temperature is decreasing in autumn and plants could use that as a signal. But the problem is that plants have to start to initiate so many physiological processes that it would be much too late for them to start once temperature actually starts dropping. They have to initiate some of these processes at least before that is happening. And so temperature, while in spring it is a very reliable cue for becoming active, because once it gets warm, plants know that it will only get warmer and warmer. Whereas in autumn, once it's getting actually cold, it might be too late for you to actually initiate some of these physiological responses. So there have to be other drivers that play a role. And one obvious cue is day length, meaning that the longer the days, or the shorter the days in autumn, the more likely they are to undergo senescence. And these are the two main drivers that people have previously used to predict autumn senescence. So these so-called process-based phenology models, they were always based on autumn day length and autumn temperature, a combination of these two cues. The problem was that these models, they worked relatively, or they could predict some of the variation in autumn senescence, but they didn't work too well. So it always seemed that we are missing something here. and we don't see the full picture. And then there was a study 8 years ago that basically suggested that spring leave out, so basically the time when plants start to be active in spring, that already has an effect on autumn senescence. So what we see here is in the upper panel for 2 species, we see the difference in spring leave out between an ambient treatment and a +6 degree warming treatment. So the warmer it was in spring, the earlier species leaved out. And then these plants were kept under the exact same conditions during the growing season. And we still saw differences in autumn senescence. So those trees that actually leafed out earlier, they also senesced earlier. So there seemed to be these carryover effects that previous phenological stages, they somehow already affect autumn senescence. And the big question was, what is really driving this? Is this mainly just an artifact of pathogen attacks, that if you leave out earlier, you're more likely to be affected by pathogens? Or is it a drought effect that you leave out earlier, you're more likely to become or undergo drought stress earlier? But we can control for some of these factors in experiments, and we still see that effect essentially. So there was another hypothesis that came up that was basically saying it's a developmental race. It's if you start earlier, if you start to run earlier, you are also entering the finish line earlier. And that is something that, I will refer to here as basically developmental constraints. It's a very complex topic, and it's something that is just beginning to be understood. But the important thing about that is that these developmental constraints they are so far not at all captured by global vegetation models, which are predicting autumn's phenology or the end of the season solely based on temperature, basically. And therefore, they are also predicting a strong lengthening of the growing season, because if autumn temperatures become warmer, these vegetation models will predict that autumn senescence and productivity will really extend. So then we can actually look at what's really happening when it comes to autumn phenology. And what we really see is that what I already said for spring is that we see a strong advance in spring phenology. So on average, this is for Europe, data for Europe, for European trees, and over the past 70 years, spring leaf out has been advancing by approximately 2 weeks. Whereas for autumn, all we see is a very slight delay in autumn phenology by 2 days. So while in spring a lot seems to be happening, in autumn not much appears to be happening. And the question is that because it's all day length, or is it maybe because other factors are counterbalancing each other? And so what we basically came up with is something that integrates these previous studies and these previous findings, and we can now go through the growing season cycle and come up with hypotheses about what should actually be happening. And so if we have here the leaf chlorophyll curve over the course of a year, obviously in spring, leaf out is happening, and so chlorophyll content will go up. And then at a certain point in the year, chlorophyll concentrations will start to go down again, and leaf senescence will be initiated. And we can call that the start of senescence. And now what we know from these previous studies that showed that these carryover effects, we can think that in a year that has actually a relatively slow development, a late leaf out, and relatively cold temperatures early in the season, senescence should start relatively late. Whereas in a year, or if these carryover effects were true, and we have a year with early leaf out and with warm temperatures early in the season, then we can expect that senescence might start earlier because of these carryover effects, these probably developmental constraints. Now, the remaining part of the curve, that should really be driven by autumn temperatures, because we know that the progression of senescence is really strongly modulated by autumn temperatures. So in cold autumns, we should have a relatively fast drop in this chlorophyll curve, whereas in warm autumns, this whole process should be delayed, and what I call here the 50% senescence date, so the date when 50% of the chlorophyll has been lost, that should be driven a lot by autumn temperatures. So based on this, we basically have three predictions that arise, and one is that the pre-solstice, our early season activity should strongly affect the start of senescence. And why am I always talking about the pre-solstice effect? So actually taking the longest day of the year as kind of a benchmark in this whole season. It's because we know that photosynthesis, but also growth, declines strongly after the summer solstice. So the plant development can be expected to really, especially in trees, be happening before the summer solstice. So one expectation can be that this whole growing season cycle, or the effects on autumn senescence, they really reverse at the summer solstice. But we'll see later if that is really true. In this graph, the green curve here shows the cell division rates, stem growth rates, and we can see that it's always, for both these tree species, it's always highest before the summer solstice and really strongly decreases thereafter. So we have this first set of, or this first hypothesis which relates to these pre-solstice effects, and then we have the second idea is that the progression of senescence then should be strongly driven by autumn temperature. And then we can also expect that there is kind of an interaction between the two, which means in a year where senescence starts earlier because of an early onset of the season, that should also mean that plants become sensitive to autumn cooling earlier, because the senescence is basically initiated earlier. So plants should really become sensitive to autumn temperature, or the progression of senescence should be driven earlier by autumn temperature. And so we have these three hypotheses related to this whole growing season cycle and autumn senescence, and now we can just have a look and basically test these predictions. And as I already showed, one really cool data set is this phenology database from Europe, because it has long-term observations, and in that case we used 7 tree species, integrated environmental data. And what can be done then is to simply check for different drivers. And autumn temperature, as we can see here, has a strong positive effect, meaning that it delays senescence as expected. And one can also test the effects of precipitation, spring leaf-out, vapor pressure deficit, summer temperature. But there was one additional effect that we looked at, and this was basically the early season productivity of trees. And this really had a strong negative effect on autumn senescence. So productivity early in the season has this negative effect, autumn temperature has this positive effect. And we can here also look at the univariate correlation between photosynthesis and autumn senescence, and it is negative. Now the next question was, does this actually hold for only these few European forests, or is this true for basically the entire Northern Hemisphere forest region? And these red pixels, they indicate regions in which we see this negative correlation between pre-solstice growth and growth. In that case, it's GPP. So it's basically the GPP from leaf out, gross primary productivity from leaf out until the longest day of the year. And blue pixels would indicate that it's a positive effect. It's positively correlated. So more productivity, a later start of senescence, whereas these red pixels indicate a negative correlation. And we see that across the majority of pixels, across 84% of pixels in total. It's significant for 22, but across 84%, we see this trend that higher productivity early in the season translates to an earlier start of senescence. And now the next question was, does this whole effect really reverse exactly at the summer solstice, or is it maybe flexible? And so the overall trend I saw was that if I look at the monthly correlations, And these are the correlations between monthly productivity estimates with the start of autumn senescence. And what we really see is that this whole correlation, it reverses from June to July. We can even use shorter intervals, and we will really see that it really is around the 21st of June that this effect reverses. But the question remained, like, is this just a general trend we see across the entire Northern Hemisphere, or do we really see that for each individual tree species? And we had these 4 trees that have really abundant data for Europe, and we really see that in all of these 4 really common European tree species, the effect reverses exactly from June to July, so that it's really the early season productivity, the pre-solstice productivity, that has this negative effect on autumn senescence, or that leads to advances in autumn senescence. We can also test this with experiments, so we can modify temperature in different times of the year. And when I did that, I basically saw the same pattern, that in May and June, a reduction in photosynthesis had the strongest effect on autumn senescence, whereas in July and August, we didn't have significant effects anymore. And I didn't test later stages, but if we would reduce temperature in September, I'm pretty sure you see the opposite, namely that it would lead to an advance in senescence rather than a delay if you cool the trees. So we really see that this pre-solstice productivity consistently across experiments and long-term remote sensing, as well as observational data. This seems to hold. Now, one remaining question we had was, is this also really consistent along latitude? So because it might be that in regions where spring leave-out happens rather late, this whole pre-season or like this early season effect is also happening until later in the season. And for that, I basically looked at this effect reversal, where the effect of temperature on autumn senescence, it reverses from negative to positive. And we really saw it, so the red line is the important part here. And what we really see is that no matter at which latitude you are, the effect is always estimated to reverse around the 26th of June, which is some days after the solstice. But of course, like, it's hard to really, in these correlational analysis, to really get to the 21st of June. But the really important part here was that there is no latitudinal trend in this effect reversal. It's always consistent really shortly after the summer solstice. Whereas for spring leaf out, this is the green line here, we really see, of course, that at higher latitudes, the trees, they leave out later, but this effect reversal still always occurs really very shortly after the summer solstice. Right, so now what about the effect of autumn temperature? How does this come into play? And the idea basically was that the start of senescence actually should be quite independent of autumn temperature, whereas the progression of senescence, the later stages of senescence, should then be modulated by autumn temperatures. And if we look at the correlation, so the important part here in this graph, these are different drivers that have been tested. The important part is that bar, which is the post-solstice temperature, so basically the autumn temperature. And we see that there's basically no effect of autumn temperature on the start of senescence, whereas again, the pre-solstice temperature, the early season temperature, has the strong negative correlation with the start of senescence. It's actually the main driver of the start of senescence. Whereas the later stages of senescence then were much more strongly also correlated with autumn temperature. And we see this expected positive correlation that if it's warm in autumn, this delays the whole senescence progression, and therefore the later stages of senescence will happen later. Right. And yeah, we can also look at different times of the year, or different pre-seasons, basically, because we know that, of course, autumn temperature is going to play only a role shortly before senescence is actually happening. So we can look at different intervals And what we see here with the senescence 50 date is that basically the period 1 month before the average autumn senescence date is always the period that had the highest positive correlation with where autumn temperature has the highest correlation with senescence dates, and it's positive. Whereas for the start of senescence, we never get any positive correlation with senescence, basically showing that the start of senescence is really independent of autumn temperature. So there was one remaining question, and that was, if all this is really true, then we should expect that because we have earlier spring leaf out, senescence should also start earlier. And this should then mean that plants should become sensitive to autumn temperature also earlier in the year. And it's a bit complicated to actually test this because it's all correlational analysis and we don't have any physiological markers for when these trees, they actually become sensitive to autumn temperature. But what we can do is we can look at basically the best pre-season, so the temperature period that is best correlated with autumn temperature, with autumn senescence. And we can look at this for different periods in the past. So we can create basically a moving window analysis where we look at the 1950s, the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, and current years to see if this pre-season length or the period that is most highly correlated with autumn temperature has been shifting. And if we do that, we actually see that the start, what we model as the start date of when plants become sensitive to autumn temperature, it has been advancing over recent decades, which really indicates that yes, plants, they tend to become sensitive to autumn temperature earlier. So if we think about this whole cycle again, it really seems that all these three proposed ideas, there is evidence for them, and it seems to hold. Now the question is, of course, what does this mean for the future? What do all these results imply when it comes to what's gonna in the end happen under climate warming? And one important thing, of course, is that what we see here is that pre-solstice productivity is actually increasing across most of these regions over time. So red pixels basically indicate that over the past decades, early season productivity has been increasing. And we know that there is this negative correlation between productivity, pre-solstice productivity, and the start of senescence. So this, of course, implies that if productivity is increasing and it's negatively correlated with senescence, then we should actually expect an earlier onset of senescence in the future. Now, is this really happening? And the data we could use for that is satellite data. It's only for the past 20 years, so it's a rather uncertain data set. But we see overall a significant negative trend in the start of senescence, meaning that yes, senescence dates on average across the entire northern forest region, they are advancing at the moment. And we can do kind of an additional test where we control for this effect of pre-solstice temperature. We can basically include pre-solstice productivity as an additional driver in the model to basically say what would be the temporal trend if we assume that no changes in pre-solstice productivity are happening. And if we do that, we then see that we actually would expect delays in the start of senescence. So it really seems that this pre-solstice effect is the driver here that leads to these slight advances in the start date of senescence that we actually observe over recent decades. And we can then include these predictions into so-called process-based phenological models. And there are historic models of autumn senescence. They mainly only relied on, as I already said, they relied on autumn temperature. And if we run these models, what we see here is the prediction for the rest of the century. And we see that these models that basically rely on autumn temperature, they predict strong delays in autumn senescence. Then there are like second generation models basically that also already account for some of these other factors for growing season temperature, and they predict that these delays should not be as pronounced. And now the model that we use that is basically informed by this early season productivity, these models basically suggest that no changes are going to happen, and that at the end of the century, senescence might even occur a bit earlier. So these predictions, they basically, so they strongly differ depending on which model we now use. And the one thing I also want to emphasize here is that whereas our model basically predicted that senescence might even occur a bit earlier in the future, this does not mean that we are predicting that overall growing season length is becoming shorter. If we look at overall growing season length, our model, these two green models, they still predict a lengthening of the overall growing season, but this lengthening is mainly driven by advances in spring leaf out and not delays in autumn senescence. And this also, it perfectly matches what these actual trends we see at the moment that really, where we see that spring leaf out is really strongly advancing at the moment, whereas autumn senescence is not really changing. So to summarize all this and to basically ask now, will autumn senescence now occur later or earlier under climate change? What do we really expect? The answer is it depends on what we actually are looking at. So what these results basically suggest is that, yes, we can kind of expect an earlier start of senescence, but we can't expect an earlier end of senescence or an earlier progression of senescence, because autumn temperatures are still modulating this whole progression. So an earlier start and a later end of senescence, it kind of indicates that the overall senescence duration might be lengthening. And then, of course, we can also look at if this is already maybe even happening. And what we see here is that the pattern is not as clear, because of course there's a lot of noise in these data sets, but overall we really see that per decade that the duration of senescence has been lengthening by 2 days per decade. And this is of course driven by these trends that the start of senescence is actually advancing a bit, whereas the later stages of senescence, they are delaying. Right, so the next important thing here, of course, was this reversal at the summer solstice, because this is something that vegetation models, they do not capture at all at the moment. And importantly, these early season effects, these pre-solstice effects that have these cascading effects on the start date of senescence, they are not accounted for at all in vegetation models. And this, of course, really matters because these effects, they really counteract all these drivers that are happening in autumn. And therefore, they appear to play a really important role that should be accounted for. And so, just to remind you again of what the main idea here is, it's these developmental constraints that essentially, if we start running earlier and faster, we arrive earlier, and therefore we will see early autumn senescence. And overall, what this now means is that previously autumn or dynamic global vegetation models in general, they predict plant carbon capture based on environmental factors, temperature, water, daylight, also nutrient supply. And of course, what they need information on is the overall growing season length, because only during the growing season, when the trees are on, when the leaves are on the tree, is plant carbon capture possible, of course. But now what these results actually suggest is that the opposite is also true, that plant carbon capture, or at least the activity of plants, the growth of plants itself, has an effect on growing season length. And this is not accounted for so far, and it makes, of course, the whole thing a bit more complex, because it means that there is an interaction between these things, and it's not just a unidirectional a unidirectional framework. It works both ways. And yeah, with that, I'm already at the end, and I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions.
Damon wanted to ask what you mean by developmental constraints.
What I mean by developmental constraints? Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a undefined term, and what I mainly mean is that you can imagine that if you start to grow earlier, all your what you need to do is you grow, and then you mature your buds. You have a lot of maturation processes that are happening, and this whole process is happening earlier. It might just be that your whole seasonal rhythm is just shifted to earlier dates, and therefore you just also see the earlier end of the season. But it's really like at the moment it's really unclear whether these.
But that just implies that there's a time, right? It's not really a constraint. It's a timing thing. It says when you start.
But the time itself, like, it is defined by temperature, because it means if it's warmer in the beginning of the season, you grow faster. So it's not just like time measured as the number of days itself, because then like the alternative would really be that it's another hypothesis that it's just leaf lifespan basically that determines autumn senescence. And that would mean that the best correlation we should see is between leaf out and leaf senescence. That when the leaf comes on determines when the leaves come off, basically. But that correlation is much weaker, and it actually disappears if I account for these early season temperature effects. So to me, it really seems that because these, at least in these northern regions, trees are so highly sensitive to how warm it is in the beginning of the season, that seems to like fasten the whole, speed up the whole development of trees, and that might simply lead to this earlier end.
So like the trees have a certain amount of work to do, and if they get done early, they're done. I still struggling with what the.
I know it's hard to understand what exactly is going on there, but there's definitely.
I guess I'm thinking in terms of what's the selective constraints that led to this, right? What's that long-term benefit for the plant to have senescence early if it did all the photosynthesis it needs to do?
If you think that all the plant, like what a lot of trees they need to do is run through all their seasonal processes, and the most important thing is, of course, in the end, that you're able to have buds that are mature and that are well protected against winter freezing temperatures. And of course, if these processes they happen earlier, the plant is basically safe to undergo senescence. And it's also kind of a strategy that, well, if you've done all your job, you can say, I might rather go for the safe strategy and senesce a bit earlier and not risk anything anymore.
I gotcha.
Whereas, like that could be, evolutionarily, that could explain this. Because I think in herbaceous plants, it's well known that there is like in corn or in other annual plants, there is a strong time effect that if you start early, you senesce early. And even, I think even productivity is known to affect that in some of these plants. Whereas now what my experiment suggests is that it's not like photosynthesis itself, but it seems to be other mechanisms, because like really temperature is a bit more important than productivity itself. And it's of course very highly correlated with each other, because what determines productivity in the beginning of the year is mainly temperature.
But the temperature is just a signal, right? To the plant, or no?
Well, in that case, I would say it's also determining, it is determining the speed of development in the beginning of the year. So the signal, of course, is happening when it comes to leaf out, whether the plant should leaf out earlier or later. That is, of course, a signal to the plant, or in that case, temperature is a signal. But then after leaf out, what's happening in the beginning of the year once the leaves are there, that I wouldn't say it's a signal. That is really like determining the rate or the speed of development in trees.
I'll shut up because I tend to go on with questions, so I'm going to let somebody else.
Cade, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. This is a great talk. I was just wondering how you think like some of the free air CO2 experiments that they've done in forests fit into this, because I think that they've seen like earlier leaf out, potentially higher productivity, and then later leaf senescence in some of those experiments in deciduous trees over a few years. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, that's like in the first paper we published on this, we talked a lot about this correlation between productivity and autumn senescence, and some of the people who had done these phase experiments, they came and said, well, you know, in these phase experiments, we don't really see that. So are you really sure it's productivity itself that is driving this, or is it maybe just a correlation with temperature, as I said before? And I think, well, first of all, in these phase experiments, there's a lot of mixed evidence. There's some studies that actually show the opposite. So it's not as clear, but what is definitely clear is that more productivity as a result of higher CO2 levels, it doesn't always lead to earlier senescence. And so I think that it can be kind of an independent, like the CO2 fertilization effect can be independent of these, what I call developmental constraints. And it's really highly uncertain what is happening in each individual tree when it comes to CO2 fertilization. It might affect the root development, and it might somehow increase nutrient uptake, where we also know that this has a strong effect on senescent states. So it's really a complex interaction between a lot of factors, and it's not really, but yeah, you're totally right. Like it's what these phase experiments show is that there is a lot of mixed evidence, and there's definitely no clear pattern when it comes to CO2 fertilization.
Thanks.
Ying, you can go ahead and unmute, and then after they ask their question, there's one comment to also be asked.
Thank you. Thanks for this really interesting and inspiring talk. And just to follow up the question about development constraint, I have a few comments. As I heard, I read a few articles talking about this relationship between productivity and fall phenology. There's a theory which is called carbon sequestration limitation theory. So I guess, well, but I don't know if this theory has been well tested. I guess not. But I guess current situation is plants are environmentally constrained, you know, because the limited growing season and based on the environment. And as we had warming, that actually increased the productivity. And I guess the plants are just reaching to their developmental constraint because they can only do this amount of the carbon sequestration and then done within the growing season. So this is what I guess for this part. And I have another question about this. So my question is, how do you define the start and 50% of senescence for ground observations and also satellite images? And I noted that you used different data sets. So how do you define those phenotypes? Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I only used satellite data for that because unfortunately, these observational databases, it's almost impossible to, like, it's really easy to observe spring leaf out because it's just a time when the tree transitions from having no leaves to having some leaves. Whereas with autumn senescence, it's really a mess to ask. And because these people are often citizen scientists who are like just, no scientists. They just go out there because they really enjoy being in nature and observe these trees. And you need some kind of simple definition, which is why usually the definition for autumn senescence that everyone is observing is the 50% coloration date. Because it's a pretty simple, or like not pretty simple, but the most obvious stage to be observed. Whereas the start of senescence, it's almost impossible to know whether some leaves, they just wilted or they just died because some pathogens attacked them, or because it's really already the start of senescence. So we don't have that data for observations, but for remote sensing data, we can very well like use in that case, it's the enhanced vegetation index. And for that, of course, for every year we see a maximum, and then we can simply say when we drop by at least 10% in the EVI maximum, this is basically the start of senescence. So it's a very early stage of when these greenness indices, when they drop. But you're right. And for experiments, I can also do that because I can measure chlorophyll content and I can really create these precise curves. But for these long-term observations, this data is simply not available.
I see. Thank you. Have you used there's a phenology product, remote sensing phenology product based on MODIS images that use also the enhanced vegetation index EVI time series, but it gives you 4 transitional points. I think that's green up, maturity, senescence, and dormancy. Have you thought about using that product?
That is it. Like some of the analysis I showed, it's exactly based on that product. Oh, it is. Yeah, it is the 2 stages we used was the start of senescence. What they actually call it senescence, like this, what I now call the start of senescence in that product. They call it, there's senescence, then the 50% date is the mid green down date, and then dormancy is basically when most of the color has gone. So there are these 3 autumn phenology stages in this data set. But of course, the earlier ones are the more important ones because the later ones are just a result of, I
see. So that senescence date from the product is the same as what you have as start of senescence, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, the comment online is from Gregory Shaner. He says you have an impressive amount of phenological data in Europe. Who collects this? Is it a citizen science effort?
It mainly is. Yeah, I think it's related to all the meteorological stations in Germany, or mainly Germany, that for weather forecast, people were also always interested, especially historically, in knowing when the crops would start to flower and fruit. And then, it's mainly a citizen science project where we really know that some of these trees, these are trees that grow in the garden of some person who has really been observing this for 70 years. And that's why we have this really valuable data. Unfortunately, also the monitoring effort is really decreasing at the moment because we are losing basically these citizen scientists that are interested in doing that job. So the best, the 1950s to 2000, that was really the time when the majority of phenological observations happen. Now we're losing observations, but we still maintain some data sets to continue these time series.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Okay.
Thanks so much. It's great to
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And then goodbye, everyone.
Get some rest. You've talked all day today.
Yeah, it was a long day. I mean, it's almost 9 here. It's evening.
Yeah.
It's been
all
a
right,
long
thank
day,
you.
but it's all right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.